Alright guys, BLM here back with a new video, and in this video we're back with another player ranking for season of Survivor that I've done a retrospective for, and here we're doing that for Survivor Vanuatu. So in this video I'll be ranking all 18 players of Survivor Vanuatu based on how I feel like they played on this specific season, and with that let's just jump right into it. We're at number 18, obviously the bottom place person on this list is actually a pretty difficult spot to determine here. I feel like Vanuatu is a season where many of the early boots are not actually that bad, and a lot of that comes from the way that the power structures were set up in Vanuatu, where on both of the starting tribes, there were these nearly equal groups starting off the game. Again, there was this very split dynamic on both of these tribes, because again, all these early boots, again, had a decent amount of allies at one point in the game, which again makes this a little bit difficult. However, at number 18, the main deciding factor for me ends up being just how actively bad they played the game, where I do feel like this is a person that you could argue should be higher than the next few people we talk about, as this is a person that had probably more potential in the game, or had they played the game optimally, they would have been in a very strong position. However, again, that's the point. They played suboptimally, so much so they burned their entire game, and that person is Dolly. And again, I very much debated this. I feel like Dolly and the next person we'll be talking about are very, very close. However, that person did survive past Dolly, but also, again, while played poorly, I don't think played as actively bad as Dolly, to where, again, Dolly really had the entire game set up for her. Again, she was in this spot where there was this split dynamic between the men and the women. She was the swing vote. She was the person that could side with either side. And while, to be fair, I mean, that doesn't lead to her having much control over the game, especially after this first round, it still puts her in a spot where she should be relatively safe, especially if she is still able to maintain relationships with both sides. And I do think she ends up going with the right idea. Again, she does side with the younger women, which is a power structure that, again, she seems to be much better ingrained within, where you have the likes of like Eliza, who is someone that's easy to throw under the bus, and someone like Eliza, who, again, really shouldn't even be in that group, to where I think Dolly, again, makes the correct call by the end of it. The problem is that she very much wavers on her decision, where, again, that comes to the poor play from her, and the fact that, again, despite her having this entire game set up for her, she ends up not taking advantage of it by her just being so indecisive on this decision, despite the fact that it should have been a very easy one, where she does very much contemplate working with the older women, and through that, she really ends up leading them on to the point where the younger women don't fully trust her either, with Eliza obviously being Eliza and being extremely paranoid, where this all leads up to Eliza flipping to take out Dolly, which, again, I think is really poor play. Now, again, I think there's the argument that, again, there was a point in the game where Dolly was better positioned than the next person we'll be talking about, and really better than most of the pre-jurors on this season. I just think the fact that she is so responsible for her own boot, and how all she had to do is just make a concrete decision and she would have been fine. The fact that she completely sabotages that position while also not doing that much active work to be in that position to begin with, again, I think is enough to put her at the bottom here, number 18. Now, number 17, and again, this is a person that I initially thought was going to be at the bottom, despite the fact they're not one of the first couple boots on the board. I mean, this person is someone that, again, doesn't really do anything particularly well on this season. To while they had allies in the game, again, so did everyone else on this season, to where, again, it was a bit tough to land this person, but at number 17, I'm going to go with Mia. And again, I think the debate between Mia and Dolly is pretty close for me. I feel like Mia is a player that never had much potential in the game, especially long term, to where I feel like she's someone that irritated most of her tribe and was considered this like loudmouth, to where, while again, she definitely had allies, and again, she could definitely navigate her way through the game, I feel like she was never going to really get the respect to end up winning the game by the end. But it's also her loud mouth also makes her a bigger target on the board. Again, makes her a bigger target than the likes of a Julie or Eliza even at that point. We see her get into these arguments with Twila and Scout, which is not particularly good, though again, she did have a good amount of allies. Again, she came into that first round having the likes of Julie and Lisa Kefir and Eliza and Dolly with her. Now, again, at the end of the day, as we mentioned, again, Dolly was indecisive, Eliza ends up flipping, and that's not great, but again, it's still a position where Mia technically comes into that round with the majority. Ends up losing it, not really due to anything that she actually does. So where, again, I think that is something to credit Mia for. Again, the downsides are the fact that Mia, again, is the very next target once that situation happens. And again, her being targeted over Eliza, someone that was not particularly liked and constantly talked about as this easy person to get rid of, I think is also a knock there. Also, Mia, again, just does not play particularly well to really get any numbers back after the vote happens. Instead, just like, again, further burns relationships with the likes of Twila and Scout. So again, I don't think Mia's a good player here. I do think her positioning, again, was never as good as Dolly's, which is what makes that a bit of a debate, though at the end of the day, I also feel like her play, while again, not optimal, again, was not as suboptimal as Dolly's was. And again, a lot of her position in the game is simply due to how poorly Dolly played, where, again, definitely a bad game, but again, enough minor non-negatives there, I guess, to put her here at number 17. Now number 16, and now we're going through a massive streak of people here from all the same alliance. And we're starting it off with the first boot of the season, and we got Brooke Garrity. And Brooke, again, is the first boot of the season. He is taken out in a 5-3-1 vote in a spot where, again, technically he had 4 people on his side. There were the 4 younger men that were his allies. Or again, I think for a first boot, I think Brooke is a pretty decent one, especially considering the fact that, well, again, I think the young men definitely played poorly and making it too obvious that they were aligned. I do feel like a lot of that still stemmed from pregame, to where, again, obviously, while pregame is still part of the game, and they could have, again, not acted chummy in Ponderosa. I do feel like situations like that are still, like, a bit wonky, especially when correlating it to how poorly they played while on the island, as, again, while on the island, we don't really see Brooke doing anything wrong. I mean, he simply is just there, again, with a decent amount of allies, in a spot where, like, he wasn't even the initial target, where initially the men did want to take out JP, but then decided to keep JP around because he was trying to make the fire, while Brooke was also a known super fan, and they thought he could be a threat because of that, to where, again, I think Brooke is kind of unlucky in the game. I think Brooke has multiple other factors playing into him being the first boot here. Again, the fact that the men made it too obvious they were close to each other, which, again, I don't fully know who exactly to blame for that. Also, the reasoning that he himself was targeted during that round is, again, also a kind of wonky situation, to where, again, I think Brooke is kind of a decent first boot here. Again, had a decent amount of allies, had some weird outside game circumstances affect his game, to where, again, we don't really see him in the game do anything that suboptimal, to where, again, in comparison to like some Mia and Dolly, who I think do a lot more actively wrong. While in the game, I feel like for me it was enough to put Brooke here at number 16. Number 15, and again, we're keeping with the same alliance, going, again, one step higher, and that person is John P. And again, JP is a player here that is essentially just, again, a step above Brooke. Again, he's in the same alliance. He was actually going to be the first target had it not been for just the concept of him trying to make the fire, I guess, and that changing up the vote to where I do feel he kind of gets saved, just kind of do things that he didn't particularly control, to where, for some reason, again, the older men just really looked at him as this, like, big threat in the game. They talked about how they let him stay in the game. He was going to be a big threat by the end, where, again, it doesn't really even make sense why that's the case. But I did feel like JP, like, just had this massive bullseye on his back, to where, again, I don't know if to really fault him for that. I don't know if he really did things to put that target on his back, or if that's just a thing just due to natural perception coming into the season. I genuinely don't know. But obviously, like, JP is taken out with no real chance to save himself, and by the time that the Brooke vote happens, he's pretty dead in the water, though. Again, I think there was actually a little bit of a debate for me between him and Brooke, where, again, at least Brooke wasn't the initial target, but again, I still think the fact that they did ultimately keep JP around over Brooke, again, is enough to put JP one spot higher, even though I think in the grand scheme of things, I think there's definitely an argument that JP is a worse player than Brooke. But again, for me, it's enough to put him here at number 15. Now number 14, moving on to, again, another player in the same alliance, so a player that I actually went a bit up on after my rewatch, though it doesn't really help him on this list in particular, and that player is Brady. And Brady is a player that I always remembered as this, like, massive dud. This person who really brought nothing to the show, and this person who was just this, like, largely affable player, but not one that, again, really does much. Again, he was part of this younger men group that just gets taken out one after one, to where, while that is kind of true, I do think Brady actually had some game to him on the rewatch. I actually do feel like Brady, again, has some decent play at points. I mean, we do see him, like, putting out a lot of work in trying to flip over Sarge and turn him against Rory. Now, I do think his, like, seeming personal vendetta against Rory does feel very weird, but outside that, again, I do feel like he does play pretty optimally after the fact that he's on the bottom, with him seeming to have the most connections on the other side than the other younger men, though at the same time, again, that could just be because he was pretty much the same age as the older men. But still, I think he does good work in maintaining some relationships there. Again, it keeps him safe for those first few votes, to where while it couldn't ultimately save him at the time he's booted, I do think there's at least a little bit of a spark there, and that, again, I could see a world where Brady actually ends up being a pretty competent player, though obviously we'll never see that. But again, I think he played this season fine, again, in comparison to the people around this list. Again, he obviously survives over JP and Brooke, that's something. And again, I think he probably is a better player than them too, where, again, at least that's enough to put him here at number 14. Now, number 13, who would have guessed it? We're rounding out this alliance. What a shocker. We have John Kenny. And John Kenny obviously survives longer than Brady. I mean, technically, he's still voted out the next tribal he goes to, but again, much later in the game. And John Kenny's a player that I feel like I remembered him actually being a better player than what he actually is. I do feel like he seemed like a player that, again, could have had some good play within him. But then through this rewatch, I kind of realized, like, oh, he's kind of just a dodo the entire time. Where, well, again, he seemed to have some decent connections with some of the older older men. I believe he was close to Bubba and close to Chris. Again, they still didn't like him and they hated his guts and called him a massive idiot behind his back, to where, I mean, Chris, even in more recent interviews, years after the show, still calls John Kenny an idiot. Or, I mean, the fact that John Kenny was voted out over the likes of Julie and Twila, these two people the men had just met, over John Kenny they'd known the entire time, again, it's pretty insane. Now, we do know John Kenny probably would have flipped eventually if he had gotten to the merge, though I think John Kenny was still a much more reliable number than Julie in particular, to where I still think that's a pretty insane call, and a particularly bad call for the one that was actually making that decision in Chris, to where, again, John Kenny supposedly was loyal to Chris and actually wanted Chris to win the game, and the fact that he, again, seemingly hated John Kenny behind his back and took him out of the game, again, I think is bad, again, for Chris, but also bad for John Kenny, that he wasn't able to get this guy that he was actually loyal to actually be loyal to him, and mixing out the fact that, again, he's still part of this group that gets taken out one by one early on the merge, and while, again, he does do a competent move in giving the immunity idol to Amy to not piss off anyone on the women's tribe, again, at the end of the day, it's just, again, kind of an obvious move to make. And even in his boot, again, his boot is actually pretty ridiculous, to where, again, as I mentioned, again, it's ridiculous that they're trying to keep around Julie over the likes of Dawn, but the problem is that he himself didn't even want Julie gone. His plan was to take out Chad, which in itself would have been terrible for the men coming to the merge, even worse for the men coming to the merge than John Kenny, where by that point, I mean, even though, again, it no matter anyway, I think John Kenny was going home anyway, but it's not even like he was giving them another option to take out, as again, they were never going to vote out Chad. So again, I think John Kenny actually is a pretty bad player in retrospect. I do think there are, again, glimmers of, again, him playing somewhat competently, but most of his game's pretty bad, with no one really respecting him, no one really even trusting him, and him being taken out on the spot where he really shouldn't have. So again, because of that for me is here number 13. Now number 12, moving on to another pre-juror, yet moving back to the women's side of things, and here we do have Lisa Kefir. And Lisa Kefir is a weird player in Survivor history to me. I mean, she is a player that does talk about wanting to play with honor and loyalty, and gets taken out in a spot where she's extremely bitter that the fact that Amy turned on her over a kind of ridiculous situation where I will say I do think the Lisa Kefir vote off feels like it was done simply due to miscommunication. I do believe Lisa in the sense that she wasn't actually targeting Amy, though Amy took her comments to mean that she was targeting her, though at the same time, again, I think it's the fact that Lisa didn't instill trust with Amy to make her believe her. Again, it's still a fault on Lisa's end, but again, that really all stems back to the early portions of the game. Again, it is a very weird situation where Lisa Kefir, again, being one of the older women on that tribe, decides to stick with the younger women and is part of their alliance until obviously they lose the numbers, because the Dolly vote off and they end up being tied coming the falling round, where she then just proceeds to flip on her original group, burning her original group, but also not really putting her in a good position on the other side either. Now, again, I think it's actually an interesting thing to assess from her, like, as a player in the grand scheme of things, the fact that she was willing to be this adaptable in the game. But at the same time, I feel like it's a game that, again, kind of gets you what she got handed to her. Again, a spot where your new alliance doesn't trust you, to where you're just sniped out at the next time when it's convenient, because they just don't trust you. Now, again, at the end of the day, I mean, Lisa does survive a decent amount of votes here. I mean, she even survives over the next person that we'll be talking about. So where, again, I think that is enough to put her this high on the list, despite the fact that, again, I do think her boot does really stem from some suboptimal play from her, even though, again, I think the actual basis of her being voted out is just kind of ridiculous. But still, very wonky game here at number 12. Now number 11, moving on to the last pre-merger on the list, where the entire top 10 is all the post-mergers. Yeah, at number 11, we're going in, I guess, with the best pre-juror here, and that person is Bubba. And, I mean, Bubba is someone that I think you can qualm with, obviously, again, when we're going back to the argument of, like, who played the most actively bad. I do feel like Bubba, again, made a very big mistake. Again, he got himself voted out of the game, where women did want to vote out Rory before him until he made this attempt to call over to Chris and get him to throw the challenge, and that got him voted out. And again, that is very bad. However, I do think his game outside that is pretty decent. I mean, he is in a spot where he was actually, like, really well positioned on the original men's tribe, where really him and Chris were really running the show, and Chris has said post-show that he was actually truly loyal to Bubba, and had Bubba stayed in the game, he would have remained loyal to him, to where, again, I think it puts Bubba in a very strong position. Again, he essentially gets swap screwed, again, being in a minority while also being away from all of his allies, where, again, I think that is something that's obviously very unlucky for him. And even beyond that, again, he was initially going to be safe. Now, again, obviously you can qualm with the fact that he got himself voted out, but again, I think that is something to factor in here as well. The fact that just naturally he is someone that the women wanted to keep around over Rory. And mixed in with the fact that, again, he was pretty much on the top of the power structure on the original men's tribe. I do feel like, again, puts him in a decent spot on this list. Again, I think he still makes a big mistake to get himself himself voted out. And he's obviously taken out before a couple of people that are on the list later than him. Yeah, I think his play before the swap is pretty strong, with him just coming off as a very affable figure that everyone wanted to work with, which is the reason why he's here at number 11. Now, number 10, moving on to getting rid of the only juror left on the list. And at number 10, we do have Rory. And Rory is a very tough player to assess here. I think there are definitely arguments for him being worse than Bubba, as again, I think Bubba was better positioned than Rory throughout most of their run. Even then, again, he was going to be saved over Rory until he made his own mistake. Yeah, I do feel like Rory, despite having some very questionable play at points, again, does survive all the way to the merge, does also survive over Lisa, which, to be fair, I think that is the main defining factor for me. The fact that Lisa gets taken out over Rory definitively puts him above Bubba, as again, really up until the Bubba boot, I think Bubba is by far better than Rory. It's not particularly close, but the fact that Rory had to face that adversity again and go to tribal again and was able to overcome that, I feel like that is enough. Especially as, again, during that round, it very much felt like Rory kept himself completely out of the conversation of being taken out, to where it seemed to be more of a conversation of, do we take out Lisa or Eliza? And while obviously that can just be chalked up to physical strength, I do feel like Rory had some, again, competent enough play to get him through that. And again, was in the initial majority, was in the Fat Five. Now again, he was on the bottom of the Fat Five, where again, while technically I believe Sarge was someone that was probably going to be targeted over him if they had actually gotten to a Final Five situation, I do feel like Rory, again, it's not really long for the game in that spot. Again, probably just taken out at 4, and even beyond that, even if he had gotten to the end, has no respect from the jury, to where I don't think there's a way that Rory can win this game. And mixing that with the fact that, again, younger men did not particularly like him either, with Brady in particular voting for Rory every time, and also Rory, again, not having the greatest social game in the world, again, really getting into fights a lot with Sarge for seemingly no reason. Also him, again, picking a fight with Amy on his way out. And again, the fact that the women that he spent time with at the swap end up turning on him by the time to merge and are willing to take him out over the likes of Chris or Chad, I think is a pretty damning situation there. And to be fair, I mean, there is definitely merits to that move for those women, particularly in trying to pull over the likes of Twila and Julie over and getting rid of the person that they are actually least connected to. But still, I do feel like in Rory's game is just a lot of ups and downs. I do think there's a serious argument for Bubba being higher than him. And to be fair, I think in most aspects, Bubba is a better player than him. Yeah, I do feel like with Rory, I do think the fact that he survives to the merge, and the fact that he, again, survives the Lisa Kefir vote and was still in the majority for the entire pre-merge and not like fully on the bottom. And I at least don't think he's the first person picked off of that power structure. Again, I think it's enough to land him here at number 10. Now, number 9, we're moving on to a player that I actually had higher on my initial draft of this list, to where, again, just from watching the season itself, I did come out of this list thinking this person would be higher. However, having listened to more post-game interviews and doing a bit more research into the season, at number 9, I do have Sarge. And Sarge is a very difficult player to assess, in the sense that Sarge obviously comes into the merge being this massive target, and again, he was essentially just going home whenever he didn't win immunity, with no real chance to save himself, though at the same time, I do think he built pretty strong relationships in the game. Again, he had a strong bond with obviously Chris and Chad and Bubba, and beyond that, also had the connection with Twila, though obviously none of those really mattered by the end of the day. But for me, there's like these two really massive conflicting aspects of Sarge's game for me. The fact that, again, like obviously he was out in front the entire time. He was looked at as the leader of the men's tribe, even though he really wasn't. But again, he was out in front, and through that, I think there's something that I give him a lot of credit for. I would give him the most credit for pulling together the older men and making the Fat Five, where supposedly that was purely a Sarge thing, where supposedly the younger men were thinking that they would have the numbers and try to pull in Sarge, and Sarge didn't want to work with that group and flip the votes on them. Again, supposedly it was a purely Sarge idea to get the Fat Five together, which again, that is impressive, considering that group did remain the majority for the entire pre-swap phase of the game, again, systematically taking out their enemies. So again, the issue for me is the fact that he was also not well positioned within that group. While it's never explored on their show, the reality is that Sarge was at the bottom of that pecking order. Again, he was someone that the likes of Chris and Bubba did look at as a threat in the game and wanted to be the first out of that group, and really just everyone looked at Sarge as a massive threat in the game. Again, that is the issue with Sarge, is the fact that, again, he's so out in front, a spot where he really was not able to hide his threat level. And through that, again, I don't think there's really a chance of Sarge making it to the end of the game. Again, even if the men did come into the merge with the numbers, numbers, he still has to completely win out at the tail end of the game, which obviously isn't particularly likely. So again, originally I did have him higher on this list. I actually had him at number 7. Initially thinking that he would have a good chance at winning had Fat 5 actually gotten to the final 5, thinking again he was at least tied to Chris and Bubba and would at least be able to get in a spot where all he would need is final immunity. I think in reality, again, looking back on it, again, he was just never really that close to winning the game. He was in a spot where he would have need to win at least 3 immunity challenges to get the win, which again, I think is a very tough path for him, to where again, definitely lowered my opinion of Sarge as a player to where that's what lands him here at number 9. On number 8, we're moving on to a person who made it a bit deeper into the game. There might be a bit of a shock that this person is this low, where there's a lot of talk about how underrated of a player this is, and I do think it is an underrated player. I think as a person, if they were to play it again, I think there would be a lot of potential for that player. However, when looking at the game they played in this season, it's not really that good, and that person is Julie Berry. And again, I think Julie Berry, again, yes, I think she is a very savvy social player. I think she is someone that, while she doesn't have the full killer instinct, I think at least showed glimpses of it, to where I can definitely see where if she comes back, she's essentially, again, just Parvati 2.0. Yeah, obviously we didn't really get that. Again, we're simply just basing it on this one appearance, and again, this one appearance is very sloppy. Again, she's very rarely in the majority group the entire season. Again, she starts off, again, supposedly in what was going to be the majority group, but again, Dolly messed it up. But either way, ends up being on the bottom of the women's group after that, gets swapped into a spot where she's once again on the bottom. And to be fair, again, in that spot, she plays decently well. Again, she's able to build strong enough bonds, the likes of Chris and Sarge, to where she's not the first target from that group. To where, while again, after John Kenny, if they were to go to a tribal again, I do think she is probably booted there, but still, again, she was able to survive a round that she really shouldn't have, and obviously flip back to the merge in a spot where she seemed to be influential in pulling Twila over, again, making a proactive lie to make it seem like the men were willing to cut her, which again, I think is very impressive play there. I think that is really the true bright spot of Julie's game, as really beyond that, along with the fact that she also was able to really infiltrate the women's alliance, where we had this older women alliance of Amy, Leanne, Scout, and Twila that seemed poised to run the show, only for Julie to somehow be able to infiltrate that and become the third amongst Amy and Leanne, which I think is very impressive play there, that she was able to infiltrate that group, though at the same time, that's pretty much all she really does for the rest of the game, where after that, again, she's blindsided the Leanne vote, completely left out everything happening there. She then is on the bottom during the Amy vote, and then proceeds to get taken out herself in a spot where she trusted Chris in a spot where she shouldn't have. And to be fair, again, she does pull over Eliza during that vote, and theoretically comes pretty close to staying, in the sense that Chris does seem to actually contemplate flipping over, even though he shouldn't, to where, again, I really just look at Julie's game as very rocky. I feel like there's, again, very rarely a spot where she's in the majority, where really that point is the early merge phase of the game, where again, she was able to actively get herself in that position, which is impressive, but she doesn't really do anything with that position. She's blindsided the final 7 on the bottom the rest of the way there. She's blindsided early on in the game, is on the bottom there, and while again, I think she does good work at the swap, she's still also on the bottom in that spot, to where I just think the fact that Julie was always on the bottom, despite some decent play here and there, not enough to move her up much further than number 8 tier. Now number 7, similar thing, again, another player that I don't look at particularly highly, though they make it deep into the game, even though their game is very rocky, and that player is Eliza. And again, I think Eliza has some serious pros to her game. The fact that she was able to get all the way to the final 4 in a spot where she was pretty much ostracized from most groups that she was a part of, and also in a spot where if Eliza had somehow made the end of the game, I don't think it's impossible for Eliza to win by that point. Again, I don't think it's particularly likely. Though again, I think she would very likely get 3 votes. Though again, I think would always struggle to get another. Though I think against Twila in particular, I do think she very likely gets that vote. To where, while she wasn't striving for that situation, she was striving to go in against Chris. To where again, I don't think she beats Chris. But again, she's theoretically close to winning the game. The issues obviously are the fact that again, she's not well respected in the game, and she was just looked at as this expendable number for most of the game. To where, while again, someone like Amy leaves the game very pro Eliza, it was still a spot where she obviously had terrible relations like Scout and Twila. She was not really the most respected by any of the men by the time of the jury, to where again, I think she definitely does struggle with finding that 4th vote in a lot of situations, even though again, she very likely gets the votes of Amy, Julie, and potentially Leanne in a lot of situations. But again, really as a whole, again, her game has her just really clinging on to the game for a lot of it, to where even in the initial vote, and she was going to be the initial target for the older women, only for that to flip once Dolly became untrustworthy. And again, Eliza does flip over, which again, you can credit her flexibility in the game. Leanne, though, I think actually was kind of a bad move, as it does seem like Dolly was siding with them anyway. But really all that does, again, take out a number for your own side and make your own alliance distrust you, to where, while again, she is voting with them for the Mia vote, Mia still ends up going home there. And then at the swap, she's once again pretty expendable, where, again, she was talked about as the initial target during the actual Lisa Kefir vote, and really almost instantly after the merge vote against Rory, she once again becomes this topic of conversation as this person that we could easily drop in the game. And in general, again, had very wonky winner prospects, did not really have much control over how the game played out, and the only times that she was, again, part of this like big move in the game was when she was being looped into it at the last second, like the Dolly vote and the Leanne vote, to where, again, I don't look at Eliza's game particularly fondly, which is why she's here at number 7. Now number 6, we're moving on to a player that I debate if they should be this high. I think there's definitely an argument that they should be closer to where Sarge is. Yeah, I do feel like this person came closer to staying and probably had more paths to a win, and that player is Chad, the penultimate guy on the list. And again, Chad here, I think is essentially just a step above Sarge in most aspects. I mean, he is someone that Ozzy was part of the same alliance, the Fat Five. They ran the show in the pre-swap, in the post-swap. Again, he maintained numbers. Now, if the Fat Five were to be the final 5, I do think he is in a bit of a precarious spot where, while Sarge is going to be targeted first before him, I do think there was a lot of worry about his win equity at the end, where, while again, he wasn't looked at as big of a physical threat as Sarge, I do think there definitely is a worry of him making it to the tail end, where I do think he probably would have been booted around 3 or 4 had he not won immunity. But still, again, he makes it deeper than Sarge in that situation, where, again, I think that's something to praise for him, and it's obviously the reason why he's fundamentally above Sarge, though, again, the question is, why is he above Julie and Eliza? And the reason I decided on that is because I do feel like in this situation, he actually does go home, which is at the final 8. It's a spot where I think he gets kind of unlucky in how that round plays out, where he ends up being taken out there, despite the fact that Scout really wants to save him, and Scout does organize his entire plan to flip the vote onto Eliza, but still, it felt like a vote that was actually going to go through until people backed out at the last second, to where I think the fact that he almost stays during his boot round as well, almost, again, stops this pagonging that eventually gets stopped in the following episode. But that vote gone through, I think Chad is actually in a pretty good spot to go on to win the game. Again, at that point, he is at the final 4 alongside Twila and Scout, who are not particularly good at challenges, where he only needs to win a couple to get to the very end of the game, where, while I do think he would have taken Chris to the end, who I think is a tougher competition, I think it's at least, again, a spot where there's at least a debate there. I think it would at least be a somewhat close vote. And if he had stumbled his way into getting to the end against a Twila or a Scout, he handily wins the game in that spot. And while, again, I don't think Chris necessarily wanted to go to the end with Chad, I think there's at least a world where Chris would take him to the end, again, with them, again, being number 1s for a good chunk of the game at that point. And I do think Chad, again, was in a decent spot to potentially win the game, had that vote flip, which, again, it seemed like it was going to at a point to where, while, again, it doesn't, and again, he's still booted at 8, I do feel, again, I at least see a path for him to go on to win the game. And I do feel like his game before the merge was actually a really stable one. And even after the merge, I don't feel like he plays the game particularly poorly. I don't think he necessarily does anything specifically wrong, because I do have Chad here at number 6. Now number 5, and at number 5, again, I do find it funny that the top 5 essentially is Chris plus the older women group from the original Yes Sir. Yeah, again, I do think these are the best players of the game. I think the older women of Yes Sir in particular are this group that really took control from earlier on and really ran the show in their respective tribes. Yeah, we're going to be starting it off with Amy. And Amy, I think, is a bit of a debate here. Again, I think Amy versus Leanne is very close. Obviously, they played a very similar game. They really ran the game together. And along with that, Amy obviously survives a round over Leanne, though, again, Amy was the target during that round if Leanne didn't win immunity, to where Amy was more out in front. I think Amy was making a lot of these decisions a lot more openly, to where we even see like the decision to take out Lisa Kefir or something that was directly on Amy, with how annoyed she was at Lisa's verbiage when talking to her. For a while, again, it wasn't really a very strategic decision. It does show her having control of that portion of the game. Again, also early on, when you see her playing the middle decently well, again, her being connected to both the older women and younger women. Now, again, I think there is definitely some suboptimal play from Amy. I think the fact that she is so cold in her demeanor, and through that, again, isn't particularly well loved by the people that she isn't directly working with. Again, that's not great. Again, the way she treats Rory is not great, where he instantly flips on her coming to the merge. And in general, again, I think she struggles to win a jury vote. I think when looking at the board. I think it's very unlikely she gets any of the men's votes, where Chris even post-show constantly talk about how he was never voting for Amy to win at the end, even from people on her own side. Again, the likes of Twila talks about never trusting Amy, and with Scout also having some harsh words for her as well. Again, I think she struggles to get those votes as well. It's where, again, I think Amy has a tough time winning the game. I really think the only way she wins the game is probably against Eliza, as I think in every other situation, she probably just struggles to get the vote. And even then, again, that was in a spot where she was trying to make that happen, as she was willing to vote Eliza at 7. Now, to be fair, again, she didn't want to vote Eliza at 7. She was simply just doing that because that's what the other women were wanting to do, which, again, definitely is something to take away credit from her for. The fact that she didn't get her way at the final 7, though at the same time, again, that was a terrible move to go after Eliza. And that's a lot of the reason why that flip is able to occur, because Eliza is so aware of the fact that she's on the bottom at that point, which again was poor play from Leanne more so than it was on Amy. Amy was very gung-ho about wanting a woman to win the game, wanting to keep the women all together. It just ends up being outnumbered in that position. And something to also praise Amy for, because I also feel like she comes relatively close to staying the following round, where she was able to actually flip Eliza back on board and almost had the numbers to stay, despite Eliza having just flipped on her the previous round. Had she been able to pull Chris on board, which, to be fair, was never really happening, she would have been able to pull off pretty impressive maneuver there. And also just the concept of having Eliza flip in that position, I think is pretty good on Amy, to where, again, I think Amy, as a whole, still very impressive player. At the end of the day, I did end up going with number 5 for her. Now number 4, and here we're moving on with the earliest boot of the bunch, and that player is Leanne. And Leanne's an interesting player, as I do think over time Leanne gets very much praised as the person who was potentially running the all-women's alliance, and again, I think there's some merit to that. Realistically, I think it was largely, again, a mixed effort between her and Amy, to where I think they did things together, though there are points in the season where we do see Amy saying that she hasn't made a decision yet because she needs Leanne's approval, to where, again, that's something that kind of proves Leanne's importance in the game, to where, while, again, I think she is someone that I don't know how, actually integral she was to how they navigated through the game. I do feel like she still was, again, in a dominant alliance the entire time, worked alongside Amy in doing whatever Amy did, and also gets kind of unlucky in her boot round, where more than likely the boot is Amy during that round if Amy did not win immunity. So where, again, I think there are definitely things to praise Leanne with Leanne very much coming off as the good cop to Amy's bad cop, to where Leanne had gotten to the end of the game against Amy. I think it's very likely that Leanne goes on to win the game, with her being more liked by the men in particular, and her probably squeezing out at least one other vote, and her also seeming to be the person that kind of glued the older and younger women together, to where we do see her having a good connection with Julie, and we also hear that Lexa, Scout, and Twila always trusted Leanne, but didn't trust Amy. Again, Leanne, I think, is a competent player. I do struggle with recognizing how active some of her play was, where obviously some of this could be the edit, but we obviously never really hear her explain her game. We never really hear her have this real gusto in the game, to where I don't know how much there really was necessarily, but I do think she plays the game pretty well for the most part. While obviously she is eventually blindsided at 7, it's still a spot where she was really safe in the game up to that point, and it was in the majority alliance, and again, debatably had power in the game, at least had, again, some masterful positioning from her own side of the game, where, again, I think Leanne is a very solid player. I think she's someone that definitely demonstrated a lot of ability for the game, yet still was a relatively early boot or replacement on the list. Yeah, at the end of the day, I did end up going with number 4. Now, number 3, and the top 3 here are the top 3, and who would have guessed that at number 3 is the third placer in Scout. And Scout's a player that I always remember pretty fondly. I always remember Scout as one of the best players from this season, probably one of the best players from this era of the show. However, I think after this rewatch, I'm a bit down on that opinion. While I do think Scout is still a very competent player, and one that, again, was playing very strategically at points, I feel like she is also someone that is never really in a position to do anything about that, to where even though obviously the move is made at 7 and it was Scout's idea, it's actually a move that is executed by Twila really unpromptedly by Scout, where I think I always remembered it as the final 7 move being Scout's move, when in reality, I feel like it's very much Twila's move. And it's a move that Scout actually tried to attempt at the final 8 and failed at. So the fact that, again, I think she fails at that move and also ends up essentially being kicked out of her own alliance, where by that point Julie ends up usurping her spot in the game, which again I think is very bad. For while again the move is eventually made at 7, I feel like she wasn't as integral to that move as I personally would have wanted her to be, to where while she is again able to maintain in the majority following that, she's also again in a bad spot in the majority, where she's able to pull over Twila's loyalty over Scout, where while Scout would have taken Twila to the end, and to be fair, would have beaten Twila, to where, again, Scout does technically, on paper, come close to winning the game. She also ended up losing the loyalty of Twila, to where Twila was more loyal to Chris in the end game than she was to her, to where, mixing out the fact that, again, she treated certain jury members poorly, again, called them out at tribals, and would just, in general, argue with the likes of Eliza. Again, her jury prospects are not particularly good outside of Twila, which, to be fair, again, is the situation she was trying to go for. But, and even looking back on her early game, again, she is in the majority the entire time, and that's something to definitely give her credit for. And I will say something about Scout that is extremely impressive, though, is her early game. Again, the fact that she is somehow never targeted throughout the entire early game portion, in a spot where, again, Scout was very clearly the weakest competitor on the board, someone that couldn't even participate in the majority of challenges due to her having a bum need, where, again, the fact that she was just such a liability in the majority of challenges and was still able to be kept around, being part of the actual majority alliance, is actually kind of insane, to where, and I think there definitely are pros to Scout's game. However, I just feel like her lack of win equity and her not even having the full loyalty of her number one ally in the game, and also just some other wonky things here and there, I think is enough to put her here number 3. Now, number 2, and obviously the top 2 here are the top 2, and unshockingly, it's just the order of the top 2. At number 2, I have Twila. And again, I think you could very much debate this in terms of their navigation through the game. I think Twila's navigation through the game is a lot more stable than the number 1 person, though adding in jury prospects and how they treated people, I think it becomes very clear that Twila is number 2 here. I think it's very tough to justify Twila as number 1, considering how poorly I feel like she handled many of the jury members, and with her obviously having some of the worst jury management I've ever seen with the likes of Eliza, her also mistreating the likes of Amy and Leanne on their way out, her also just blatantly backstabbing Sarge. Again, she's in this spot where I think she very much struggles to win a jury vote. I don't think she can win a jury vote against anybody on the jury. I think it's a tough path here, to where even in her best case scenario going against Scout or even against Eliza, I think she still ultimately ends up losing in that situation. So again, I don't think Twila can win the game. However, I do think her navigation through the game is very impressive. Probably the most impressive of this entire cast. Again, being in a spot where she's initially in the majority alliance. Again, despite how abrasive a personality she is, she's someone that's still kept around early on. And it's pretty lock safe through the first 2 votes. She's very unfortunate in being swapped into the bottom, losing all of her allies. Despite that, I feel like she plays pretty well. Again, she's able to build a genuine bond with all the men to the point where they add them to their alliance, can make her a new 4th within the men's alliance, which I think is very impressive from Twila. And mixing that, the fact that, again, she builds this final 2 deal with Chris and is never even talked about as a potential target over the likes of Julie or John Kenny, I think is very impressive there. The problem is that that's obviously what makes the later backstab of Sarge even more damning for her jury prospects, and just the notion of her flipping back against the men, I don't think is ideal gameplay there. While I do understand the move, I think it is one where, again, she's technically being tricked by Julie and thinking that the men were against her the entire time. But really, I do feel like the optimal play probably would have been to try to stick with the men and try to pull over Scout in that instance. Yet, obviously, instead she flips over, again, burns a lot of jury prospects in that situation. So really, I do think at the end of the day, it probably was the correct call from a positioning standpoint, as I think she was much better positioned within the women than she was with the men. She's surprisingly highly positioned within the women, obviously initially being part of the older women, but even then with the inclusion of Julie, again, Scout is the one that's kicked out over Twila, to where while Twila's probably 4th on that pecking order at that point, in fact, again, she was even able to be 4th on the pecking order at that point was pretty impressive. And obviously she is the person that pulls off this Leanne move, where, again, I give her most of the credit for that move. Again, based on what we saw in the show, it seems like she was the main person that decided that now is the time to make the move and ends up putting in the legwork to do so. Again, pulls Chris into the move and then goes on to tell Chris to go to Eliza and pull her into the move, where, again, I think Twila deserves a lot of credit for getting this move to go through. The problem is, again, I think after that she, again, really just continues to burn more jury prospects, also makes the decision to want to go to the end against Chris, which I think is a very difficult situation for her, where while I think she probably loses against Scout as well, again, at least that one's a bit more of a fight. So again, she never ends up having to like directly backstab her, really due to just how comp wins result. But again, she was still really well positioned in the end game. Again, despite the fact that, again, she can't win the game, again, she still gets to a final 3 where both people are taking her to the end. She also is able to keep Chris's loyalty throughout all that and get Chris to vote out Eliza and Julie and Amy to get to that point, to where, again, I think Twila's game has a lot to praise within it. I think her navigation through the game and the level of control she demonstrated portions of the game, again, is impressive, though I think there's still qualms to be had with how personally she took the game, how poorly she treated certain jury members, and how she just had absolutely no inequity by the end, where, again, that is for me the major reason why I do have the number 1 person at number 1, because I think on paper Twila Twila is a person that played a more dominant game, yet I think her jury prospects really sink her here to be here number 2. Now number 1, the number 1 player of Survivor Vanuatu is unshockingly the winner in Chris Doherty. And again, it wasn't really that close by the end. I think Chris's game, especially when taking jury prospects into consideration, again, was pretty far and away better than Twila's, where while Twila's navigation through the game is probably a bit smoother, I feel like Chris still has very impressive aspects to his game, even though, again, also very wonky ones. But again, I think Chris starts off the game very well, where again, he's part of the Fat Five. Again, he is in a pretty strong position within that, to where while he's in the person that forms an alliance, he is probably one of the people that has benefited the most from that alliance. Obviously, being directly saved in the first week, but also, again, having a good relationship with Bubba, while also having a final 2 with Chad, a final 2 with Sarge, and also having good connections with someone like a John Kenny, to where, again, he is lock safe at that point in the game. He then gets swapped over into a very fortunate position, to where there he forms a final 2 with Twila. That really ends up booning him through the game, but even beyond that, he builds a relationship with Julie, though I think that's probably where we start to see him make some very questionable strategic decisions. The fact that he ends up keeping Julie over John is a very questionable move, where again, John is someone that I think would have wanted to work with him, someone that was, again, going to flip on the guys, but not until probably after the merge vote itself, and even when he wanted to do so, he was wanting to do so with Chris. So again, I think the fact that Chris cuts John in this instance is a pretty bad move, and that Ozzy costs him at the merge, where Julie flips, and he ends up being on the bottom. Though, again, in the bottom, I think he plays decently well. Again, he's in this spot where he knows to just simply lay back, that the women are going to crack. And while he plays it passively, I think he actively plays it passively. Dude, again, I think makes some decent plays in this spot. Again, his move to vote Sarge out, but then pretend like Sarge told him to do so. Again, I think it's a decent move there to gain some sympathy from the women, and mixing out of the fact that, again, he seemingly comes pretty close to flipping the vote at the final 8, where, again, it seemed like that vote was going to go through until the last second, that Chad was going to be saved, which, again, would have put him in a really strong position if that had been the case. Again, would have put him in a spot where he would have had Chad with him by the time of the end game, someone that was going to take him to the end, someone that, again, he can beat. I don't think he necessarily for sure does, but again, theoretically he can, while also, again, still having Scout and Twila there to beat as well, where, again, it would have put him in a very, very strong spot, though obviously he still loses Chad. But obviously the move is made at 7 to flip against Leanne, though, again, that's a spot where, again, I do gripe with things, to where, again, I don't love the fact that he is kind of just a tag along in this vote, to where, again, while, again, I think he does good work in actively being passive enough to the point where the vote just comes to him, I think it's still a spot where he is essentially just being saved by Scout and Twila, and even then, not even necessarily do the things that he did. Now, again, he had a good relationship with Twila, to where that could definitely be something you very much credit him for, in him saving himself here. Yet I also just feel like a lot of that was also stemming from poor play from the likes of Leanne and Amy, and beyond that, also I feel like Chris kind of gets very fortunate in the fact that the family visit happened here, which gained him sympathy from his fiance being very emotional from losing the challenge on the way out, to where that is also something that benefited him. Now, again, I do give him credit for pulling over Eliza, at least that's something, but I do feel like this is largely a move that happens simply because of things happening around him. And I also have very questionable thoughts about his game beyond that, to where while, again, he is essentially in this swing position for really the rest of the game, he's also making calls that seemingly burn jury votes. Again, him doing effective work at 6, I think that is the right call there to take out Amy, is able to keep Eliza in line. But by the time of 5, I think he, again, makes the right call in taking out Julie. However, again, the fact that he seems to genuinely waver in that decision and keeps on leading Julie on only to blindside her, again, just felt so unnecessary, and felt like a spot where he's just risking Julie being extremely bitter at him at the end, where she almost was. And then for him to continuously just lead on Eliza beyond that, I think is also unnecessary, to where while Eliza does claim that obviously, yeah, this was the right move for Chris, as if he didn't do that, I would have turned on him. It's like, but that wouldn't have mattered when it's Scout and Twila. And even then, Chris had immunity by the end anyway. I just really feel like the Eliza thing is also unnecessary. And while, again, I think he obviously just outright gets Eliza's vote against Twila, no matter what happens here, I still feel like, again, it's him really risking jury votes for no reason. But again, I do think there's still good play within all of this. Again, he's able to pull Twila away from Scout. Again, he builds his final to his Twila, to where Twila is more loyal to him than Scout, despite the fact that, again, he's obviously a bigger jury threat than Scout, and also someone that she's been working within the game for shorter, which is actually kind of insane. But no matter how that final immunity played out, especially considering, again, Scout couldn't really win due to her injury, it was going to lead to Chris getting to the end and winning. And obviously he ends up having a very impressive final tribal performance that typically gets lauded by the majority of the fan base. And while again, I do still think it's a final tribal performance that wouldn't be effective to me, I think he very much caters his speech to the players around him and answers the questions in a pretty perfect way for each respective person, where again, that is very impressive from his games. Where again, in general, I think Chris's game is very good. Again, in comparison to Twila, I think Twila's navigation through games is a bit more stable, where Chris obviously loses control in the early portions of the merge, and I think some of that due to some poor decision making from him. I also think he makes some weird strategic decisions towards the end game. Yeah, against Twila, I feel like Twila just has much worse social play and had almost no win prospects, where I feel like Chris beats most people on the board, with him just auto getting the votes of Sarge and Chad, also very likely to get the votes of Twila and Scout, and even potentially Julie in many situations. Again, I think Chris was a massive jury threat on the board, yet was somehow able to navigate through the game without ever being targeted, while being able to be in the swing position for most of the end game stretch, to where, while again, I think there's definitely issues to be had with how unimportant he seemed to be to the actual flip occurring, and him making a pretty big mistake that caused him to be on the bottom to begin with. I do feel like, again, the impressiveness of his early game and also the tail end of his game with him having a decent amount of jury prospects is enough to put him here at number 1. But there we go. I mean, that is my player ranking for Survivor Vanuatu. Now moving forward, obviously I'll continue to do these style of videos, or early next year I'll be doing my retrospective of Survivor Palau, which I haven't watched in forever, so that'll be interesting, and I'll do a player ranking of that following that as well. And in general, obviously just expect the same style of content from the channel. But for now, that is the video. Thank you for watching.